Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I am Pat from the Whiskey Hotline here at Binny's, along with Joe. We're waiting on one non-punctual Brett Pontani, who will jump in at some point. If you got any questions throughout our discussion tonight, just please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of Zoom, and we will get them answered for you. Facebook people, ask away on Facebook, and we'll get those answered for you too. So I do want to introduce a friend of the hotline, Ian Millar, Distiller Millar, the Thriller Millar, back in town virtually from Glenfiddich here. So Ian has been a guest on our Barrel to Bottle podcast before and has taught several seminars in our stores, always brings out the good stuff. So Ian, thank you for staying up late and joining us today.
Welcome. You're welcome.
So you want to start with a little background on yourself and age yourself and tell everybody how long you've been doing this?
Okay, been doing it for some time now. So I came into the business in 1971 at a local distillery in my hometown, where I am right now, Pitlochry. So Pitlochry's got two distilleries, Blair Athol, as most of you know, and also the smallest one, Erudara. For me, it's still the smallest one because it's the only small one that's still producing stuff that you can actually drink as a mature whiskey. So I spent probably 15 years in different jobs and eventually left there as a production manager. Went into Aberfeldy and I moved to Bladnoch in 89, 90. It was with Diageo, remember? So Diageo then sold Bladnoch Distillery, which was a bit of an issue. So they transferred me up to Mortlach in Speyside. So I've been in Speyside from 91 all the way through to probably just, well, even now I'm still based in Speyside.
Yeah.
We started off at Mortlach. I did 5 years at Mortlach, then 2 years at Linkwood and Glenelgan distilleries. And then they transferred me down to Dalwhinnie and Blair Athol distillery. By which time I was already talking to William Grant and Sons about taking over their malt distilleries. So I left Diageo after 25 years and started working for William Grant to manage their Glenfiddich, Balvenie and Kinninby distilleries as general manager. I packed that in probably after about 7 years. And then I moved into more of a marketing because you wanted to create a body of ambassadors for Glenfiddich and Balvenie. And so I kind of spent about 12 years building up that body of ambassadors. When I left, we had 20 on Glenfiddich, we had probably about 10 on Balvenie, and altogether across all the brands, we actually had in excess of 100 brand ambassadors. They didn't report to me, thank God, because having a team of 20 is like having 20 kids that are all bad behaviors. So I left that in 2015 and moved into a kind of semi-retirement role where I'm I think they call it prestige whiskey specialist. So I'm involved in selling casks to people that've got a lot of money. So if you can afford to buy a small country, then you can speak to me and I'll sell you a really expensive cask.
Well, it's a real honor tonight then, I got to say. I feel as privileged and as wealthy as I've ever felt in my life. And lucky because, you know, Brett and I only have Joe on our team. So managing Joe, I thought was a handful, but you've got 100 brand ambassadors. That's interesting that we can kind of trace the roots of that brand ambassador program worldwide back to what you taught people.
2006. So the chairman of the company, Charles Gordon, called me and said, look, I want some help. Come and see me tomorrow. And then he put the phone down. I didn't know where the hell he was. I was in Scotland. It turned out he was in Portugal. So I had to fly out to Portugal the next morning just to have a meeting with him. And that's when we spent 5 or 6 hours looking at how we would build this program and the part that the family would play in that whole history, the heritage and everything, all the background you needed to support selling those brands. So it was great fun. But after 12 years, I needed out because I traveled around the world, God knows how many times. I spent 2/3 of my life in a plane or waiting for a plane. So I've not really flown much in the last 3-4 years. Played more golf, drank a little more, and I lost a little weight. I think that's the golf course is doing that. But yeah, it's been a long whiskey life, but it's been a very enjoyable whiskey life.
Yeah, well, you got the pretty perfect whiskey job now, I'd say, just curating these old casks and only selling them again to oligarchs apparently. So
yeah. There's people around the world who've got tons of money. But remember, it's not just people who have got money who want to drink it. A lot of people are buying it because they know it's a good investment right now. Whiskey is shot right up to the top of the investment charts. It's above gold, it's above jewelry, you name it, whiskey is actually at the top of the pile right now. So if you've got people out there who are interested, it doesn't really matter. If it doesn't have to be a 40 or 50-year-old. Some of the small Speyside Whiskey Festival bottlings that we sold for, I don't know, 60, 70 pounds, they're turning hand for 600, 700, 800 pounds now.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be a huge amount of money to make a huge amount of money.
Yeah, it's more of a function of bottle count than bottle age.
Yeah, yeah.
So Glenfiddich as a distillery has been around for about how long? I feel like every Scotch distillery has a date on its bottle, and then there's usually like another date that, okay, maybe they're stretching it here. We, kind of like the Bushmills thing where it's like, 1608 or whatever, and there's no actual record of distillation in that town for another 100 some odd years.
1887, we started off. So we did 130 years a couple of years ago. And so we had 2020 right now. So yeah, just over 130 years. And we're now working with the 5th and 6th generations. So the 6th generation are now getting their feet wet in the business. They have to get their feet wet in another business outside of whiskey first. And then they would be brought in when they had actually qualified from a business point of view to actually get a role in the business. So you didn't magically come in because you were family. You actually had to have some sort of trade or some value, but then you could come back into the business.
That's how they make it last for 6 generations instead of 3.
6 generations in the business now, and the 5th generation is looking to get out. So the 6th is going to have to grow up pretty damn quick. Kirsten, who you know, is one of the younger members of the 5th generation, so she's going to have quite a heavy weight on her shoulders in the not too distant future.
It's crazy. So Glenfiddich as a distillery now is what, 3rd biggest or so in Scotland as far as output goes?
Output biggest.
Biggest?
Yeah.
No. How many millions of liters were made at Glenfiddich last year?
Last year, I think we made between 14 and 15, but we brought on the new still house. So now the new still house, we had 31 copper stills, and we're moving up to 51 copper stills.
So that's an odd number of stills, which you don't see very often.
No, it's
how did you end at that number? Okay.
Remember, one wash still together with 2 spirit stills.
2 spirit stills, yeah.
So one set of 3 can do 1.5, 1.6 million liters per year. So we've got 17 sets.
And so you have these, huge wash stills, and then it's going to split.
One large wash, 2 small spirits.
Yeah, and it splits equally in the spirit stills.
Yeah, yeah.
So Bob lets us know that he's sipping the 15-year cask strength right now. I wish we could get the 15-year cask strength in the States. Maybe someone from William Grant's.
It's called Distillery Edition.
Yeah, it's very good.
51%. And you know what? If you taste if you have an old bottle of the cask strength, because you could no longer put cask strength on the label from about 5 years ago because the Scotch Whisky Association felt that a lot of people were diluting the whiskey down to 46 and calling it cask strength. So you can only call it cask strength legally now if the whiskey is bottled at the strength it came out the cask at. So the old cask strength is equal to 51% alcohol by volume. And if you taste the old cask strength Glenfiddich versus Distillery Edition, it's exactly the same flavor, same recipe.
Okay, that's cool. That's good to know.
And a damn good whiskey.
Yeah. Well, I think, for as big as Glenfiddich is, it's, I would say, arguably one of the better distilleries out there as far as a distillery of that size. Too often now with craft, people associate that only craft can be small and, made by, one guy and his 2 mules or something like that. And it's like, you can't tell someone, I dare them to go to a distiller at a distillery your size and say what you're doing isn't craft just because you're doing it on a scale, And I think, but Scotch whiskey is kind of set up uniquely in that you have this batch distillation, you're required be using batch distillation and pot stills. So everything is still done at a smaller scale. But like you said, you just do it 17 times over and you end up at these millions of liters of whiskey. So you touched on the wash still earlier, going into 2 spirit stills. One thing that struck me when I was last at Glenfiddich was kind of a unique system in the wash stills, in that they're direct fired still. And there's only a few distilleries left in Scotland that are still using direct fire stills, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, George at Glenfarclas, he's still wash and spirit. They're still direct. They're still direct. And Macallan was direct, but because it's direct fire, and it was next to a warehouse. And the health and safety executive had an issue with them having that. So we took the hint as well. So we've still got direct fired in our wash stills. On our spirit stills, we're doing something different. Well, we are in the middle of change because direct fired is costly, it's gas, and so we will still do gas fired on spirit because that's where you can really control it. But on the wash stills, we're actually taking the liquid out of the still through a super preheater, which has steams like a steam heat exchanger, and then putting it back in at a higher temperature. And as it raises in temperature, you then get this vapor going over the top. So that's on the first distillation. On the second distillation, it's still direct fired. So you've got gas burners, which took the place of coal. When I came in 1998, it was still coal fired. But we moved from coal fired over to gas in 1999, 2000, 2001. And that's because it was step by step. So we're away from coal because coal was getting us into all sorts of problems with NOx and SOx. So there's a lot of stuff going into the atmosphere that you weren't allowed to have in there. Sulfur oxide, all that kind of stuff. So we had to take coal out, and gas is much easier to run, much cheaper to run as well. So gas fired on our direct fired on our spirit stills.
That external heating system is interesting. I know there's a lot of breweries that use that and would refer to it as an external calandria, and for them it's a big efficiency thing. Where when you're heating for them the wash, mash, whatever you want to call it, outside through that external heat exchanger, and it's pumping back in, they get a much more efficient boil and efficient, Yeah,
it's like it flashes off.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, when you have those direct fired stills, though, part of the flavor, I would say, is kind of that it burns a bit of the wash, right?
You can't burn the wash on that. But we were burning the wash when you were direct fired. It's almost like if you're boiling milk, you're going to boil some of the milk or burn some of the milk onto the bottom of the pan. So what we previously had was we had chainmail drives going around the inside of the wash stills to keep the metal clean and clear so that you didn't get this burn on continually. So we still have them in the old still house, in number 2 still house, which is running in conjunction with the new super still house, which has 36 stills in it. Okay,
it's the old still house I've seen, because I remember seeing that rummager, audience, what it would be called, that kind of pulls the chain around the inside.
Right, that's what it is. Chainmail just going around there. It's just scraping the bottom, keeping it clean. Yeah.
Okay. So is there something in the still house that you feel gives Glenfiddich as a spirit most of its kind of unique character, or is this a brand that you would say is more in the wood?
For me, the lightness comes from the length of fermentation, because the length of fermentation is 72 hours. So this light fruity note that you get in a typical Glenfiddich comes from the length of fermentation. So you've got flavor congeners that are being produced during fermentation. So the longer you actually ferment, the more you get into the lighter, more interesting, fruity, grassy flavors. Short fermentations, and when I was at Bell's Distilleries, all 5 Bell's Distilleries had short fermentations, 42, 44 hours, and all 5 distilleries across the length and breadth of Scotland were producing nutty, spicy. And nutty, spicy is an undesirable you-make spirit, which eventually creates not a very good whiskey. But it was all going into Bell's blended whiskey, so it didn't really matter that much. When Diageo then absorbed all the Bell's distilleries, they put them onto a 5-day week, which meant they had longer fermentations, and they suddenly got out of the nutty spicy into more grasses, like fruities, and more interesting whiskies, and more interesting flavors. So we know that fermentation is directly related to flavor, whiskey flavor. So fermentation is more important at this point than distillation. Distillation, as long as you get the flow rate right and the temperature. So you can't do it too quickly, because if you distill too quickly, you entrain and you carry over stuff into the spirit that you don't want. So the rate of distillation is very, very important.
So fermentation takes 72 hours. About how long would a distillation take?
Distillation, to distill off one washback, which is 50,000 litres, you're talking, so you get 2 distillations. So you're talking 6 hours in a wash still. And then for the spirit alone, you're talking 3.5 hours just for the spirit part of the spirit run.
Just the cut you're taking.
Yeah, we're talking, I think we're talking something like 6 litres a minute. So that's just over a gallon and a quarter per minute. So it's a very slow distillation rate, because you get good separation then.
All right. So after stillhouse, then comes maturation, and you've got a variety of types of different casks you're using. We're seeing more and more bourbon casks in the business because they're just more and more available, right? But I like a 100% bourbon cask Scotch. I'm enjoying more and more because I think it shows more of the distillate. It doesn't cover up as much of what the distillery is actually making, I think. And that's kind of the first thing that we're looking at tonight, which is the 14-year. If anybody's tasting along with us, you want to taste the 14-year, you want to give us a rundown on this 14-year bourbon cask?
That's the BBR, Bourbon Barrel Reserve.
Oh, I'm sorry, I had the name wrong. Bourbon Barrel Reserve.
I think that's what it's called. It came from
Joe's
a
got the
whiskey
bottle in
called,
front of him. I don't have it in front of me.
No, I don't.
Yeah, a whiskey we called Rich Oak. So, but Rich Oak had European oak in it, and we wanted to Americanize it just for the American market. So this is only available in the American market. You can't get it over here. You can't get it anywhere. So, and that's why it was just American oak. Now, you talked about bourbon barrels. I always call it American oak, and the reason I call it American oak is that we actually take barrels from some rye distilleries. We take some barrels from Jack Daniels, and neither of those are bourbon casks. So it's a catch-all. We call it American oak rather than bourbon casks. But in that one, we absolutely use bourbon casks for that. BBR, Bourbon Barrel Reserve. Really sweet, soft, neat, easy. Mm-hmm. It's just a great whiskey. For the price, it's a great whiskey.
Yeah.
Tropical fruit's just jumping out of this whiskey too. Fruity.
We did a tasting up in the New York office for this. So we had 8 different samples of different strengths in terms of which Bourbon Barrel Reserve we're going to go for. So this is 11 o'clock in the morning. So we tried the 8 whiskies as they were neat, and we had our favorites. But then we said, actually, most people in the States will actually drink this with ice. So we then poured another 8 whiskies and we put ice into them all and tried them again, just to be sure. That's how serious I take my work.
It's a tough job.
I don't know that people are drinking that much whiskey, that much scotch on ice anymore, though. But I mean, I don't know. I think that's more of a demographic thing.
I think whiskey's up to 16. It's fine with ice, but I think beyond 16 years old, it's maybe about giving the whiskey a bit of respect and just either taking it neat or whether you drop water. Mm-hmm. But you've got a lot of serious whiskey drinkers coming into Binny's. And that might not be the typical whiskey drinker in the States. So I think there's still a lot of whiskey, in particular in the South, because the South is warm. Yeah. I've been to a lot of warm countries, and I like 12 and I like 15 with little ice. It's just nicer in a hot climate. Mm-hmm. A bit like Scotland, you know.
I've been looking at the weather in Scotland, and I've been envious because it's just been, we'll say this weather isn't agreeable for an overweight pale man, and we'll leave it at that.
Well, we're about 68, 70 degrees, which is just perfect. It doesn't have to be too hot. If it's too hot, and it's too hot. So 70 degrees is fine.
So BBR, Bourbon Barrel Reserve, the American expression, I suppose, the Americanized expression of Glenfiddich. A lot of longtime Glenfiddich fans, I think, when they think of Glenfiddich, the one bottling that really comes to mind for them is the 15-year, which used to be called Solaire something or other. I know it just got a packaging change. It still is.
Yeah. Solaire, it's on the bottom level.
Oh, right on. Yeah, old bottle.
You got this
Yeah,
one? Grand
ours
Cru?
is. Which one's that?
Grand Cru?
Oh, yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. Well, let's talk about Solaire first, then we'll get to Grand Cru, I guess. So Solaire is named Solaire because of its kind of extra maturation finishing period, right? Which can't really count for the age.
No, I mean, they're all 15 to begin with. So the three ingredients are Glenfiddich 15-year-old out of European oak, Glenfiddich 15-year-old out of American oak. The third ingredient is the second ingredient, but finished for a further 4 months in brand new American oak. And that really drives up the heavy sweetness that you get in the Solaire. So it makes it very rounded, very grounded. It's bold, but it's very easy on the palate. I like this one as it comes in a glass like this, slightly warmed up, and it's just good to go. It doesn't need anything. So no matter where you are in the world, if you drink Glenfiddich straight from the bottle, you get the same outcome every time. The Solaire process we liked in Spain, it was there to create a more consistent sherry year to year. We like that idea because if you're going to take three very diverse casks or whiskies from three different types of casks, you need some sort of process that ensures you've got consistency. So we have the Solaire vat. The vat itself is never emptied below the 50% mark. We then put the three ingredients in, we top it up, and we gently air rise it, and we mix it up with what's already in the vat. So the vat hasn't been empty since we filled it in 1998.
Wow.
That doesn't mean the whiskey is older. It just means that we have a nice consistent process. So the vat is used primarily just for mixing. We then put it into marrying tuns for those whiskies, those three whiskies, get 3 to 4 months beyond the 15 years to gently come together in traditional wooden marrying tuns, which are made of Portuguese oak. And they're about 2,000 litres. So that's, what's that? 2,000 litres, 500 gallons. They're not big, 500 gallons.
Yeah, very big. Too big to be considered legally adding age to the whiskey because they have to be 700 liters or less.
Yeah, correct.
To count toward aging of the whiskey.
Correct. So purely for marrying.
Yeah. Would you say that's your favorite Glenfiddich? Is that what's in your glass you're enjoying right now?
Yeah.
And you can drink anything there behind you. Is that the one you reached for?
Yeah, 15 is probably my go-to all the time. I have to say the Grand Cru I really like. We have a new Balvenie. Edge of Burnhead Wood. It's 19 years old. I don't think you've got it yet.
Burnhead Wood? I don't think we've seen that one yet.
No,
Edge of Burnhead Wood. So this was one of my projects back in 2000 when we took barley from the field above Glenfiddich, above Balvenie, sorry, on the Balvenie estate, and we dried it over coal in maltings, and we also burnt heather from the Burnhead wood on top of the coal, so it's infused with the fumes from the heather flower. So that's one to watch out for because I think this will be coming your way pretty soon.
It will be coming to the States. That's cool. So that's part of the Balvenie Stories line? Is that what? Okay.
Yeah, 19.
So you touched on that earlier. For people that might not know, Glenfiddich and Balvenie share one big campus along with a kind of forgotten distillery in a garage called Kinninvie, which is a beautiful little distillery. And that's malt from Kinninvie is really only being used for various blends, right? I mean, we saw a single malt a few years ago in a small bottle, but I don't think we've seen anything.
23
Yeah,
year old?
23, I think, yeah.
I think
Half
we've done
size
it
bottles.
20, we've done it 25. You know how old it is now? It's just turned 30 years old.
Really?
Glenfiddich, on the 4th of July. It's not bad from an independent
Made
company.
for an American limited edition. You got to bottle some up.
There you go. Hey, we'll do one in the American oak for you.
Hey, Ian,
That'd be
Jack H asks us if the bourbon barrels are used as is or if they're rebuilt or enlarged before aging spirit.
You know, they used to come over, we call it ships. So they're taken down into individual stave form, and then they were shipped across because it was cheaper to do that. Then our coopers would just rebuild them. But you know what? We just don't have enough coopers nowadays. So you get what's called distillery runs, and distillery runs have been coopered 100%. So they're ready to go as soon as they hit the ground here. So they won't have done a maturation of a bourbon or a rye or whatever for, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years. We prefer that it's only 2 to 3 years, because then you've got tons of vanillin and goodness left in the cask for us to use, and we get much longer out of it. But once we've done something like the first maturation, will actually absorb most of the vanillin out, most of the heavy vanilla sweetness out. You might get half of it left over into the second maturation, but by that time you really need to get involved in recharring it. So we've now got a dechar, rechar process to actually lengthen the lifespan of the American oak itself. So we're Scottish. We like to get as much out of it as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to make the cheap joke. I'll leave that to you.
No. But Tony might when he comes in.
So welcome back, Brett.
Oh, hey guys. What have I missed?
Brett's been yelling at one of your competitors for the last half hour, so I'm sure he can use the taste of Glenfiddich now.
Surely not.
We
Brett
talked
will
about, yeah, he never yells. We talked about some long fermentation at Glenfiddich, 72-hour
Yes.
fermentation, producing nice fruity esters. We talked about a double distillation on a 3-still set of stills. And we talked about the 14-year-old Bourbon Barrel Reserve. I got to get the name right. And our beloved 15-year-old, of course. Yeah, it's getting lost in your background there. Why don't you just tell us the name of the bottle you're drinking? 14, there you go.
It's 15.
Well, Brett's got the 4. Brett's catching up, I suppose. So,
He's got BBR. He's got BBR.
So, Ian, you touched on one of the newest ones earlier, which was that Grand Cru. You want to let everybody know what's going on with that?
Well, Grand Cru is 23. So what I like about this is we've got the 21-year-old rum finish. We've also got which is probably still my favorite outside of, if I'm going for something slightly more expensive, I do like the rum finish 21. The Grand Cru is finished in cuvee casks, and it's quite a low strength, 40-43, and it is just too good. It's so easy to drink, so soft. There's nothing harsh, nothing aggressive in there, and this shouldn't be at a 23-year-old. Beyond the 23, we're also going to do a Grand Cru, which is going to be finished in cognac casks. So that's coming down the pipeline probably sometime later this year when it hits the US. So from a Balvenie point of view, there's 2 or 3 new stories coming out, but we've also got the Glenfiddich. We're certainly at the high end. We're coming out with more Glenfiddichs, but at the high end. So the Grand Cru is going to be a 26-year-old.
Okay.
That will take over from the existing 26-year-old, which is just American oak.
Which is a beautiful whiskey. I think that's my favorite of the high-end Glenfiddichs. That's going away.
It's going away. It's a difficult one, this one, because if you use, remember we talked about using the vanillin up in American oak. Once you've exhausted the vanillin, you get into different flavors which are still there. And Brian Kinsman was playing in his lab, and he found this stuff, and he went, it's very light in color, because obviously the wood's almost exhausted, but it came up with this lovely grapefruit zest on the nose and on the taste, and it's just such a delightful, and so different from everything else that we've ever done from a Glenfiddich point of view. This came out at the same time as we did a 25-year-old in travel retail. The 25-year-old was American and European oak mix. And I was kind of concerned that it would outshout the 26 on taste. So I introduced the 25 and 26 to all of our brand ambassadors. And thankfully, they all said, yeah, the 26 is the one it comes out top.
But if you remember too, I mean, this is the whole thing, the fight, and you have been at the front end of that for the last, well, you're not that old, so last 5 years, even though probably 35 is more like it. You were at the front end. If you remember the releases that you guys had done of a couple of the vintage casks that were out, and we're talking about the 90s, early 2000s, probably mid 2000s, and people for a long time associated Glenfiddich with sherry. And you remember releasing the single cask of the vintage with bourbon and the single cask vintage sherry. And I still remember to this day fighting with my customers till I got them to actually open a bottle and try it. And what ultimately was more well liked and more well pursued, and this was 15 years ago, was always the bourbon wood. Was that like 76, 77, right? The 76, 77?
It was a 1976. And
the
we
76s.
And we drank it at Binny's on the same night. We did 30 and we did a couple of 40s. But the whiskey of the night was the 1976 American oak cask.
Yeah. And people were like, well, but it's not sherried. And it's not sherried. And those days aren't going to come back probably. I mean, what's it been like for you guys? Do you know what's it been like for you guys to source the similar sorts of sherry barrels now to basically fill for your grandchildren?
Well, because we've gotten bigger, we're now having to go to 3 different suppliers. So we're using Tabasa, we're using Juan Miguel Martin, but we're also using the Paz family, Paez, and they produce for Macallan and a few others as well. They do something like 270 sherry butts per week, and they will not do any more because that's the limit that they can do at the quality that they want to put out. The Paz ones are just out of this world, but it's completely different. You remember around 1970, Spain made it illegal to export casks with sherry in them. And it was at that point you've seen this major change in what we could get our hands on. So suddenly they started to produce casks for us, and with this infused with sherry, and we had no control over what was going on. So I think if you look at the sherry casks we're getting in now, everybody's getting in more or less the same type of wood with the same type of sherry finish in it. So we're becoming kind of very similar. If you go back to pre-1970, we were getting casks that were Montolado sherry, cream sherries, Bristol sherries, and even light sherries. You know, and the blend, it was the blender, up to the blend to then blend them away and ensure that he came up with something consistent. So I think we've lost something. I'd love some distiller, maybe William Grant and Sons, to actually go back and buy themselves a Spanish bodega and start producing different sherries so that we could actually import the proper casks that were produced in the way that they were 40, 50 years ago. If we do that, I think it'll take some 20 years to make a difference, but I think we need to start investing in that sort of thing right now. But sherry has changed massively, and I think we are kind of using more or less the same type of cask with the same sherry that's used.
Well, I mean, ultimately, aren't those casks are essentially seasoned, which means that what is going in there in a lot of cases just gets turned into either sherry vinegar or alcohol, because they're at least a portion of the purpose of the wine is merely to season the cask.
Correct. So they'll do an in-cask maturation or an in-cask fermentation to drive the sherry into the wood, depending on who you go to.
Sure.
Juan Miguel and Martin is quite interesting because these guys aren't actually in Jerez. So strictly speaking, more than 50% of the sherry casks that the industry has been using aren't really sherry casks because they're not from a bodega in Spain.
Right.
don't let that put you off drinking sherry whiskey.
Well, you'll know more important what people don't let that put you off of drinking sherry, because if you want to bitch about the lack of sherry casks, then you need to start drinking more sherry to get the rest of the world caught up.
Yeah, there you go. The Paz family, who creates some really great casks, they've got a winery. 60% of the winery's output is actually vinegar, and 40% is the sherry, which is used to season the casks which are made at the cooperage. So Grandad owns it, Dad runs it, and the two sons, one runs the sherry and one runs the bodega, making the wood, the cooperage. So there's interesting times ahead, but if I was in the business right now, I'd be trying to tell the William Grant's family to buy a bodega and start investing in wood and proper sherry, because for me, that's the future.
It's a shame you have no connections with the William Grant family.
Yeah. It would be a shame that they don't. Yeah, it would be a shame that. Yeah, did they? I mean, the investment and the benefit is, as a retired distiller emeritus, if they happen to buy a sherry bodega, the sherry bodegas usually come with guest houses, and somebody needs to go down and do quality control.
I could do that.
So
I could do that. Yeah, you sold me, Brett. I'll talk to them tomorrow about it.
right.
I might actually write Glenn a note, because honestly, it's going to be tougher. The further we get into this, it's going to be tougher to actually get access to the wood you want. So for me, it makes perfect sense to own your own bodega out there and control the whole process.
And you have to see it all over the world. And part of that, part of the question that stemmed is, I get, when we do educational seminars, and I think the last 3 or 4 seminars I've done that have included older whiskeys, inevitably the question is whether it is, a Glenfiddich, a Macallan, some of the ones that are traditionally known for a very strong heritage of sherry aging, Old Highland Parks. Well, when is it going to be like the older? Am I ever going to get an old style Glenfiddich? Am I ever going to get an old? And the answer is, it's unfortunately no, for the exact reason that you just explained. I said, start drinking sherry and then maintain your palate till you're 100.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the equation, and certainly the easiest finger to point there is the change in sherry casks and the change in the way we produce sherry and sherry casks. But Ian, you pointed out earlier, simple changes in production too as well. Taking direct fire out of stills, changing from a coal to a gas, like all of this could have some impact in the flavor of the whiskey, undoubtedly.
Massive.
We were touring a couple of years ago, actually. I think the same trip we might have gone to Glenfiddich. We stopped by another large Glen, and we asked the distillery manager there. They're in the process of expanding threefold, and they were putting in a bunch of stainless steel fermenters, and they had fermenters out of, boat skin larch or Oregon pine, whatever the Scots are incorrectly calling some species of wood. And he said, listen, of course, we're going to tell you this isn't going to change anything. The whiskey's going to taste exactly the same. And then he just kind of looks around, making sure nobody else is there. And he goes, but this is absolutely changed the character of this whiskey. And it's just undoubtedly, it's just a fundamental thing that's going to change.
A third Glen with a close family connection to the Glens that own your company also, when you get to direct fire, when they remember that changed when they switched stills a few years ago and had to switch Glenfiddich. Parkless.
Yeah, but Glendronach, Glendronach used to be owned by William Grant's son, Charles.
Really?
And Charles is a great grandfather of Kirsten Grant Michaels, so it stayed in their family until 1960, when they sold Glendronach to teachers, and it used to be coal-fired. Now, I love the 15-year-old sherry cask Glendronach, because this is getting back to the heavy sherries. I like an Abuna, the Avalar Abuna. It's a big sherry bomb. I do like the big sherried whiskies, but they're nothing like what they would have been 30, 40, 50 years ago.
But the ones that show the fruit.
Coming back.
But you also, you're just saying, again, it's what you said, the fruit versus the wood, because sometimes people confuse an aggressive amount of wood tannin and phenol with sherry. And that's not really what the true great sherry whiskeys were like.
There's a gentleman who works for the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, and his name is John Connor. And John Connor will tell you that a lot of the European oak that we were getting in the 30s, 40s, and 50s wasn't European oak, it was actually American oak, because they were trading, Spain was trading with the US, and Spain had more to offer the US than the US had to offer Spain. So the boats were filled with ballast, and the ballast was American oak. And the American oak was then taken off in Spain. A lot of sherry casks were actually made with American oak because they had less tannins than the European oak, and the sherry was therefore more presentable and sweeter. There you go. So this is all stuff that he's digging out and has been digging out over the last 5 years. So the history of American oak and its influence in sherry, and therefore whiskey of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, is currently being uncovered by people like John Connor. Very
Yeah, much
interesting
greater
chap.
influence than we would have thought. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
And then any playing around with other, like your Hungarian oak, and some you're starting to see more Hungarian and Balkan oak pop up.
Yeah, we might be. Yeah, we might take a look.
Okay.
You
Just
know, there's
curious.
right
You're giving
now,
away the farm earlier with sneak peeks of 3 new releases, and all of a sudden now you can't talk about Balkan oak. Come on.
yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but obviously, you know, a secret's only a secret if you don't share it.
Correct.
But there are 11 types of oak right now that are used in maturing whiskey. That's something I can share with you. 11 types of European oak that are used. So there's 11 different countries that are producing oak. So Romania, Hungary, you know, they have oak. And if you go to Romania, there's some guys making brandy out of fruits there. And I visited this place. This guy's got an amazing still house, an amazing laboratory. It's just like it's first class. If you go down the road towards this first class factory that he has, you've still got poor people, you know, walking with horses and carts, and they've no electricity. But this place is in the middle of it. It's like a jewel, and he's producing some really great brandies from fruit, but he's maturing it in oak from his own country. Very interesting. So yes, and we've got some stuff we've got a couple of casks that we've been in Japanese oak. We put a 40-year-old Glenfiddich into Japanese oak, two hogsheads, and it is absolutely stunning. The amount of sweetness that you get from the Japanese oak versus what we get from our standard American and European oak cask. So the standard 18 that we have versus the 18 that after 4 years in Japanese oak, absolutely stunning. If I get the chance, or if you're over, see, this is the tease now. See, you can only taste this if you come to see me.
Well, there will be a period of time where Americans won't be allowed anywhere else in the world, but we're hoping that doesn't last too much longer.
If that happens, then I'll just have to come see you. I couldn't go to the Nth this year, so my flight is, I've got a coupon that tells me you can fly this same flight next year as well. If we go to the Nth next year, I will take some whiskey that has been matured in Japanese oak. By that time, it will be 21 years old.
Hey, Ian,
No,
we got
that
a
would
question. We got a question. What is the black box behind you? I assume it's the one on the right.
This one?
Yeah.
It's well, we first created a single malt back in 1963, and there's a brand ambassador out in Taiwan called Jimmy Chan. And Jimmy wanted to replicate, because we've still got the old folders, so he approached Brian Kinsman. Could Brian Kinsman replicate this whiskey? So we did, and it's called the Glenfiddich.
I remember this one. Yeah.
And you will not believe how big the war was when Glenfiddich found out that we were putting this out. So I had to go down to speak to our legal team to brief them on why we think it's the original. And yeah, so lots of books out and spent 2-3 days with the lawyers, and the conclusion was that we would agree to disagree and it would be launched. So they were miffed because we said this is the original one. They said they're the original because Glenfiddich was produced with the first license in 1823. Obviously, you know that the distillery wasn't called Glenfiddich until 1868. Anyway, it's a fight we're not going to have over here.
I would, well, that's okay. I mean, we can start, we got to think of a few different things that we can pick, a few different fights. We've already started talking about politics, and now we're talking about legal and branding. What else can we pick at?
Oh my God.
So, well, okay, enough with that. We have one more whiskey to talk about, actually, that we did want to touch on tonight. It's one of my favorites of the kind of accessibly priced that's always around in most Binning's locations, and that's the Project 20. Can you tell us what went into that?
Kiss, kiss.
I have. This is my cask.
Okay.
This was my cask and into Project 20. This is all I have left because the 2 bottles I had, they're gone. Because it's so good. But I'm going to hang on to this one because this is from the original cask, and this will go for a lot of money. This is to be part of my pension eventually, I think. So Project 20, myself and 20 ambassadors. So I talked to Brian Kinsman in December every year about what we're going to do in June with our brand ambassador, with the brand ambassador conference. And so he had this great idea that we would let them loose and that they would all go into a warehouse and choose 3 casks each. They would then give them samples from those 3 casks in the afternoon of the same day. And they would pick the best whiskey from the 3 casks that they had chosen in the warehouse. And those 20 whiskies were then all put together by Brian Kinsman into a vatting, and that was the first vatting of Project 20. 17 of those casks were American oak. 2 of them were sherry casks, and 1 was a portwood cask. And the portwood cask was chosen by Beth Havers from Canada, and it absolutely powers through. You can actually taste the port in this. It really powers through. But the 2 sherry casks actually give it a twist of interest as well. So the European oak gives it this kind of depth, but the 17 American oak casks are basically the body. It's a stunning whiskey, and it's 47, 48%. I think it's 47.8%.
Yeah, it really is. It's
so
wonderful.
The strength is good, and I've tried it versus Snow Phoenix, and for me, it outshines Snow Phoenix, the better whiskey.
Interesting. I think it's one of the best. It's one of those hidden gems in the Scotch aisle. You know, it doesn't have a flashy age statement, and it's got the dark bottle, and it's not wearing its sherry on its sleeve, but it is an awesome whiskey.
We had,
and so your cask looked like it was one of the bourbon barrels.
Yeah. It's this one's 15 years old.
So we have, this is number 2.
Yeah. It was 15 years old, and where is it? 62.4, and 1999 to 2016, so it's actually 17 years old.
That's quite strong for that age, isn't it?
62.4, yeah, but sometimes we would fill it 68.5.
Okay.
So 63.5 normally, but sometimes 68.5. 68.5 if we were going to be sending it off down to somewhere else for bottling, if it was going into a blend, for instance. And so a lot of American oak from Glenfiddich, when it was first produced back in the 90s, would have been going down there. Interesting, because it's 1999, this was a coal-fired stillhouse. See, things like that we're starting to forget. So if we stopped using worm tanks at Glenfiddich in 1972. That's not that long ago in the age of a whiskey. We went from worm tanks to condensers. So every time you change something like that, you can get quite a big change in the whiskey. People talk about coal or direct fire, but actually going from worm tanks to condensers, you get a much lighter whiskey. You get a heavy whiskey from worms because there's less copper contact through the worm than you get with a condenser. The more copper contact you get, the lighter the whiskey. So we've never actually picked up the difference. So I think we've been pretty cute with the use of casks to mask the difference between the heavy and the light over that time. But there are very few whiskies that are predate 1972 that you and I can afford to buy anyway. So it's not like we're ever going to see the difference.
Right. Well, there's nothing in the desk drawer?
In the what?
There's nothing in the desk drawer, the cabinet there. Are you in your office or are you at home?
At home.
Ah, okay.
Listen, I've got better whiskies here than we have at the distillery.
Yeah, that's what his kitchen table looks like all the time.
This was the first peated we did at Glenfiddich in 2003. So we did first peated at Bovay 2002. So this was a sherry cask. So this is a big hit because it's a sherry cask and it's heavy peated. The first heavy peated we did through Glenfiddich. This was only, I think, about £70. The Speyside Whiskey Festival.
Wow.
Probably selling about 10 times that now.
Yeah. How often are you doing peated at Glenfiddich now?
How often are we doing a Speyside Whiskey Festival bottling? Special.
Oh, you're doing the Speyside bottling every year, but are you doing any runs of peated distillate though still every year? Is that like at Alvini, you famously have the week of peated run every year. You have anything like that at Glenfiddich?
No. All we've done with the peat there is we've used it for the Fire and Cane.
Oh, that's right.
So we took some of the peated whiskey and we finished it in rum casks. But it's quite light, so I'm not sure if they've used, because there was a full-on peat back then. Mm-hmm. But the peat you get, every time we get peat, because we do a peat week through Glenfiddich as well, we just don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. But it will go into, there's a little touch of peat in some of our whiskies as well. 99% of all Glenfiddich goes into Glenfiddich single malt. But obviously that 1%, that peated that we do has to go through things like Fire and Cane. A lot of it will be left until a much later date, until it gets to 21, 30, 40.
You are still making one week a year at Glenfiddich. You're still doing a peated week.
We were doing the equivalent of 1 week through one of the still houses at Glenfiddich. So basically it's 100,000 litres, so it's like what, 20,000 gallon?
Yeah, not much.
Listen, 20,000 gallon of heavily peated whiskey goes a long way. This is at 71% alcohol by volume. You then dilute it down to 63.5 for maturation. It's still a lot of whiskey. It'd be quite amazing. And you're doing it year on year. It's not like once. We're doing it every year. Nobody's buying it. We're keeping it for ourselves. So there's a lot of stuff that's being laid down as well, which we'll look at long, because we want to know how the peat is going to work out at 2025. So a lot of stuff is being laid down right now for, it's not all about what's happening in the next 12 years. That's the great thing about it. You're laying stuff down that you'll never see and taste yourself.
Yeah.
But we're okay with that.
So are there any similar, do you have any similar projects to what you did, like we're hoping, we've just heard that the Edge of Burnhead Woods is not coming now, that possibly is delayed to the States?
Why?
Well, just like everything else that doesn't get executed, it's being blamed. COVID's being blamed.
Okay.
Well, they already teased it, so it's coming.
Yeah, okay, good. So it is coming this year, because I was just given a deck that said that it wasn't.
This one?
Yeah.
So I have, this is at 40, I think it's about 48%. I have some samples at the distillery at 57.7. I'll put some into a small sample bottle and send it to you.
Oh, that would be fantastic to try. Yeah.
Will it get there by the post? Yeah.
Yeah. No, we did actually. I just received a couple of things. Des sent me something, and I've gotten some stuff from France that way as well.
Okay. All right.
So they did. You know, it came up because we're actually excited to try. One, because people are asking. Two, I know that some of our mutual friends in Omaha we're also very, very excited for the launch of that.
Yeah, until they shut the Dundee Dell.
Yeah, there's Monique is going this weekend for her last hurrah, and then
Oh,
they
God.
close the following weekend.
Be a bit like a funeral. But
Yeah, it's going to be a bit like a funeral.
yeah, there's a few more. There's a new Glenfiddich, sorry, a new Balvenie Classic coming out, but that's for duty free. So airport. Week of Pete 17 is coming out, airport, and they're going to do a redo of Balvenie Rose at 21-year-old, and that's also going to be airport. So
Well, now
these
that
are
nobody
all-
wants to get on a plane, there's plenty of stuff to buy at the airport.
Yeah, exactly. Now's a good time to buy a ticket and go shopping.
I'm guessing that there's been a delay on the release of those. They were initially going to be something like May, June, but given the pandemic, I think there's going to be a delay on all that stuff.
Yeah, but Edgeburn Headwood is coming this year.
Well, for sure. It's it ain't cheap. 260 pounds.
Well, somebody had to go out there and pick all the heather. I mean, I assume that job
Right.
fell on you, right?
No, that was the guy that the guy who looked after the estates for me. His name was actually Dave Stewart. So it's
Oh,
not,
so
it's
you
not,
did. So Dave did have to go out, and
not
David did have to
David
go out.
Stewart, Dave Stewart.
Oh, not David Stewart, Dave Stewart. Okay.
Dave Stewart. So Dave Stewart was he looked after the estate for me. So I sent him up the hill and said, Dave, we need heather. Go get some heather. So he took down a whole pile of it, and so we dried it over the coals, or we burnt it over the coals very, very slowly. But heather, when it's dried, it burns very quickly. So we ended up having to hose the heather down and dampen it down so that it would actually burn slowly. And so it was great fun doing it, and you could actually smell out in the courtyard at Balvenie. You could smell the heather burning. It was different.
That's really cool. I
20
can't
years
wait
ago.
to taste that.
Well, how
So
much?
you-
How much different? What was the most distinctive thing that you noticed that immediately told you that it wasn't just normal peat?
Well, if you take something from the maltings, the floor maltings, because this is all floor maltings. First, the barley was grown on the estate, and right next to the estate, you've got the Edgeburn Head wood so it's all produced on site, and that's why it was essential that we did it through the floor maltings, and then we put the heather on top, the damp heather on top of the coals, and burnt it slowly. So you've got this infusion. Now, in peat, you'll find this heather anyway. And very often, although the peat is maybe 5,000 years old, you'll actually see the legs and the roots of the heather in there. You didn't want the roots of the heather because inside wood you've got sap, and I didn't want that bitterness coming through. So we cut all the roots off, so you just had the heather flower, and that's what we were burning on top of it. So there's no peat in there. You've just got the dryness. So coal doesn't deliver any taste, any flavour whatsoever. So
Really?
all of the flavour, any additional flavour, has just come from the heather itself. But if you look at Alfred Barnard's book, we had to, once we'd done this, we had to figure out, has anybody else done this before? Because the Scots Whisky Association get very nervous about you doing trials like this. So Highland Park used to burn heather on top of the peat, if you go back a long, long time ago. And Muirvord or Distillery did the same thing. They actually had heather houses at the distillery. So there's evidence that it has been done before, and this is evidence that we had to provide to the Scots Whisky Association in order to get this through as a whisky. So we've had a few other distillers asking us, what did we do and how did we get away with it? It's because there was evidence that it had been done before. Thank God. But it's a delightful whiskey. So I will send sufficient so that you, Pat and Joey can try it out some night.
Well, we'll try it and then just show them pictures of it in Omaha and let them know that we have it.
Okay. But I better send BJ some as well, because if you get it and BJ doesn't, all hell's gonna let loose.
Well, we've got a package. We've got a package being driven there by a mutual friend this weekend. So if anything comes for BJ, you can just ship it to us and trust us that we'll get it there.
Oh, jeez. I don't think BJ would be agreeing with that.
All right, well, Ian, thanks a lot for joining us today.
You're welcome.
We obviously could talk about whiskey and people in Omaha with you for hours on end here, but we do have to let everybody go. I appreciate your time. It's always great talking about all things going on at Glenfiddich. Thank you for the insight that we would never get from the marketing slags. And for everybody tuning in, we'll be back next Wednesday with Stephanie McLeod, the master blender at Dewar's, going to be talking about some crazy stuff that's going on at Dewar's. So, all right, Ian, thank you. Cheers.
Ian,
Everybody,
it's
thank you
yours.
for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.